over an extended couple of years period of time. That's dedication. Okay, folks, so we've hit about 7:30, just slightly after, so it's probably time to kick off. Nice to see you. As you know, we've kind of stepped back into doing some face-to-face sessions, and we did our first one a couple of weeks ago back in August. But we weren't covering this topic in this schedule this year, so I thought it might be a little bit helpful to A, cover it, and B, not to just drop off a cliff with Zoom, and we'll record this one as well. Hope everyone's okay with that, just so we've got it as a sort of record, and other people can catch up on it afterwards. So just let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Give us a thumbs up if you can see it. Yay, great, thank you. So let's just have a little talk about wintertime. Now, when I first started beekeeping, when people started talking about wintertime in sort of July and August, I was always a little bit kind of like, okay, but the schools are still on holiday and I really don't feel like it's autumn or even close to being winter yet. Why is all this nattering going on? And in our world, our season's sort of slightly shifted. Bees season is shifted towards earlier in the year. So by June, a colony is normally at its maximum size. And the brood laying rate is normally petering off and plateauing. And as you go through July, it's starting to decline. And into August, it's certainly starting to decline. So the bees have already realized that midsummer's gone. There's often less forage around this time of year, and their population's designed to optimize the kind of forage that they can bring in. So they know sort of autumn's coming and winter's coming, even if we haven't quite picked it up yet. And you want your colonies to survive. So let's just have a little look about what survival rates are normally like. So between 10 to 15% in most years is the number of colonies that won't make it through. So whatever you do, if you've got 10 colonies, for example, you probably aren't going to carry all 10 through winter. However much you want to, however much work you've done on them, you probably might lose one, maybe two, or 1.5 statistically, but that doesn't happen. In bad years, as you can see, the loss rate can exceed 25, even 30%, and get up to 30, maybe 35%. And I can remember some of those years in this graph, and they're really unpleasant when you come to spring and you hope your colonies are going to make it, and they don't. And the classic die-off period is not midwinter as you might think, but the classic die-off period is in February and March. And it's those years where spring is badly delayed and you're often not seeing flowering and the bees aren't flying until well into April or sometimes even later. Those years are the really tough years. They get through the middle of winter, they get through the end of winter, they even get into early spring, but they're starting to struggle. And the longer that kind of winter sort of lasts and holds on, the tougher it gets. Because remember, those bees that are surviving through winter don't just live the 6 weeks of a summer bee, but they live 6 months or maybe around 6 months. So they've increased their lifespan about 4 times, which is a neat trick if you can do it. Partly that's because they're flying less, partly because they've got less brood to feed, but they physically develop slightly differently, which is a key thing because the winter bees are your lifeline to make it from this summer through to next spring. Your winter bees need to be well fed, healthy, and in a decent number in a colony to be able to get through to spring. Those are the 3 core things that you're trying to achieve. And this is a little bit about how you might try and go about it. So what happens in winter is your bees are going to cluster. The colder it gets, the tighter the cluster. And the cluster is, I mean, if you've ever seen the videos of penguins in the Antarctic, same sort of deal. They're not hibernating, but they're concentrating their thermal mass by huddling together. And the tighter they huddle, the smaller the surface area, the better the sort of almost insulation. And there's some evidence that bees will go from the outside to the inside as they kind of get cold, and sort of there'll be movement within the cluster. It's not a fixed sort of solid thing that sort of stays there all winter. Now, the aim of that clustering, whenever there's brood, is to keep the brood temperature of however small a patch, and sometimes that patch can be small or non-existent, at the constant 35 degrees. Towards the outside of that cluster, the temperature will drop off. The bees will be able in that cluster to survive down to about 7 degrees on the outside of the cluster. But if it goes below that on the outside of the cluster, they'll start to drop off. So there needs to be some movement. And that's why the thermal insulation of a hive is a topic, because bees need some warmth. They're pretty good at it. Cold rarely kills bees, sorry. The first couple of winters I kept bees were those very cold winters of 2009, 10 and 10, 11, when the temperature was down for months, way below, I mean, -10, -15 for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And you can imagine, as a new beekeeper then, I just thought, there's never been conditions like this. They'll never make it. But they did. They're pretty canny with cold, and local well-adapted bees. And the well-adapted bit is all about not having too much brood to have to feed this monster colony over winter, being able to fly at lower temperatures, so being able to go out and get water and kind of do runs to the loo on a day that gives an opportunity. The winters up here are long. If you bring in sort of Italian stock or something like that, it's just not used to winters that we have. They may not make it. So that's the way. And also you can see the colony has moved up to, the colony's moved up into the top of the hive. Heat rises. It's just a simple principle. Heat rises. So the bees will move into the warmest place. Yeah, thanks, Chris. So bees will move up into the warmest place to keep themselves warm. Just simple physics. Hang on. Okay, so let's look at some of the reasons that bees die in winter. We've looked at some of the things you can do briefly to keep them alive and what they're doing, but why do they die? These are a couple of pictures that you don't want to see in spring. These are classic kind of starvation pictures. You can see this picture in the lower sort of right-hand side. Bees, in a desperate attempt to kind of find something in a cell, have died, heads down in the cells. It's a really miserable sight. This picture top left is similar. You can see some of the bees heads down, tiny little cluster left in the middle of a hive. The hive's just faded and faded and faded away. And sometimes you'll see, if these bees have been here a while, sometimes you'll see these bees really moldy and white, where they've been sort of they died ages ago and they just haven't made it through. So not a very happy sight to see in the springtime, and one hopefully you won't do, but it does happen. And this is a poor little bee in the bottom left that's just sort of gone out on what it thought was a nice sunny day, only to find out that there was snow on the ground, and that was the reason it was so bright out there. Got too cold, never made it home. So starvation is one of the reasons. We'll go on and have a look at some of the other reasons momentarily. So let's just talk about starvation for a minute. You want to get your colonies through winter, going into winter with 30 to 40 pounds, aim for the 40, of honey stores. Now each brood frame full will weigh about 5 pounds. Each super frame is about 2 to 2.5 pounds. So if you just try and push your colony through winter on just a brood box, you imagine to have 40 pounds of stores in that brood box, you need 8 frames stuffed full of stores. That means that colony's not got a lot of brood in it if it's got that much stores in it. So are you realistically going to be able to get a colony through winter on just the brood box, or do you maybe need a super of stores as well? Because a brood box can carry 40 pounds plus of honey, but not if it's 2/3 full of brood. It's hard to get a figure on how much pollen bees need. I mean, they'll have mixed it with honey to make bee bread to store it over winter. The nearest figure I've been able to kind of get is around £10, and that's often a harder thing to kind of spot and see. But just as you're going through your late autumn, your late summer inspections, just have a look at what the pollen stores are like, and see if there's any, and see if the bees that are coming back late in the season are bringing back pollen. Bees are canny. They want to survive. They will survive if they possibly can. You're just there to kind of give them those extra helping hands if you can. Now, whereas cold isn't a huge killer of bees, damp can be. So just let's have a little think about your apiary sites. Is it in a frost pocket? Is it in somewhere that just never gets an hour's sun midwinter, so it'll never raise the temperature in the hive? Is it in a low-lying area where there's lots of mist and things like that? It's more about hive positioning, and also if your hives are on stands, maybe think about putting your hive on a stand. A hive that's kind of on the ground or on a pallet or something like that isn't very high off. You might not get much airflow through. Is your stack of equipment sort of in line? So if you've got kind of a corner off that sort of that isn't sort of, your stack of boxes isn't in line, is damp getting in? Is water getting into the wood and causing some damp problems? Is your roof all right? If you've got felt roofs or something like that, are they in decent nick? Are they as weatherproof as they can be, or would it be better to maybe change boxes? Have a little think, but just watch out. Damp can be a big killer. One of the other ones that regularly comes up when people do surveys in the spring of what killed your bees over winter is queen issues. So a queenless colony has got very little chance of making it through a winter, or even if it does, it won't come out in spring worth a damn. Weak queens, likewise, ones that haven't been well mated during the season, have significantly less chance. And if you're looking for a definition of what I think is a viable colony, I would say if it's never ever at any point in the season got above 4 or 5 frames of brood, it's probably questionable whether it might make it. Now, there might be things you can do. You might be able to put it in a polynuke over winter and add some stores and see if you can kind of give it an extra boost that way. But a small colony in a biggish space may not survive the winter. More bees is a good way of kind of ensuring your colony makes it. If you've got some of those small, weak or queenless colonies, this is also a time of year when you might think about uniting colonies. It will strengthen colonies. You'll be able to split them again next spring. There's probably no doubt about that. But you can't split a dead colony. So if you can unite, and also this time of year, if you started the season with 2 colonies or 4 colonies and you ended the season with 8 colonies or 10 colonies, you may be at the upper end of the numbers that you want to keep. So is it another way of you keeping your colony numbers under control to look to unite some colonies that you think? There's a phrase that sort of says, take your losses in the autumn. Don't put a lot of tender loving care into some colonies that quite frankly might not have a very good chance anyway. Consider, if you've only got 1 colony, then you're going to throw everything at it to try and get it through. But if you've got a few colonies, just consider which ones may or may not kind of have the legs to make it. If you can do a disease inspection at this time of year to look for bee health, is critical over winter. As we said, these bees have got to live a long time. The healthier they are, the better chance they've got. So let's go through the hives. As you do a late autumn inspection, check for any diseases. There may not be a huge amount you can do. Hopefully there'll be nothing there at all worth worrying about. But Varroa is probably the one that we'll talk about in a minute that you can actively do something about, and that will help your bees a lot. In terms of misadventure, storms happen very often in late September, very often again in March time. You can help yourself there. You can put some darn big weights underneath your hive and strap the hive to it. You can put some darn big weights on top of your hive and strap the hive to it. If you've got those weights, it'll make it harder to tip over. If you've got the hive all strapped up, if it does go over, it'll stay in one piece, because you're only probably going to be checking the hives, unless they're in your garden or something, you might only check them monthly over winter. If they go over and all the boxes split apart, that colony's probably got almost no chance at all. So straps and weights can really kind of make a difference if you get problems. Animals and things like that. We'll talk about pests in a while, but animals, if you're in a field and there's livestock around and animals might use the hives as a scratching post and knock them over, things like that, that's not a good thing. Fencing there is a thought. And just have a think about the genetics of your bees. If you've got some bright yellowy kind of bees and you're not sure about the heritage of them, but they've been really prolific all season long, and they've done so well, and there's still massive great colonies in at this time of year and almost increasing, they might be in for a really hard run through winter if they're kind of Italian stock that just lays and lays and lays, doesn't look ahead. They're not thrifty. They don't kind of start to close down at this time of year, and that's something to watch in your own colonies. Are they starting to slim down? I mean, as I'm going around some colonies, I can see each time I'm going around, each colony is probably losing 10% or more of brood each check I'm doing at the moment. It's the queens just aren't laying so fast now. Some young queens are different. Some young queens that are newly started are still going, but a lot of them aren't. Okay, so if your bees haven't got that ideal 40 pounds of honey, what can you do? So let's talk a little bit about syrup. Syrup, sugar and water mix. Some people call it thick or heavy. Often people say 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. The 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 mixes you have to be a little bit cautious of, because they're not strictly kind of correct. Then that ratio isn't 100% right in metric, but essentially you're making a very strong sugar solution. I haven't looked around at where's the cheapest for sugar at the moment. Sugar prices have gone up a bit. Often the supermarkets, the normal supermarkets are more expensive, but sometimes you find places like Farm Foods, B&M, places like that can be 10-15p cheaper a kilo, which if you're buying 50-100 kilos can start to add up. So it's worth having a little look around, and if anyone knows where it's being sold cheaply, please do shout out at the end. So we're looking to get that syrup on. We're looking to get that syrup on earlier rather than later. Ideally, you finish all syrup feeding by the end of September, because if you start feeding into October, you can get problems with the bees taking that syrup down, but not being able to evaporate the water off. The syrup can ferment, and then the syrup can actually cause more harm than good by giving them gut problems over the winter. So the ratio of sugar to water at this time of year is 2 kilos of sugar to 1.25 litres of water. And sorry, the line underneath in Imperial should read 2 pounds to 1 pint. So the Imperial is quite a simple measure, 2 pounds to 1 pint for thick syrup, 2 kilos to 1.25 litres of water for thin syrup, for thick syrup, excuse me. Right, so somebody's saying Farm Foods, 2 1 kilo bags, so 2 kilos for 120. Yeah, it was £1 last year. It's gone up a bit. It might be the best you can do. And we're looking to get that 40 pounds of honey into the colonies. Excuse me while I just write. Let's start looking month by month where we are from here. So in August, we might start seeing the bees kicking out drones. As we've already said, the queen is probably reducing her laying rate. As we've already said, the winter bees that are being born now have got a 6 months to live rather than 6 weeks. They're physically slightly different. Their fat bodies are better developed. They have this sort of ×4 life expectancy. You're probably looking to, if you haven't already, you're probably looking to remove and extract your honey about now. I think the one thing that you can probably sort of say about this sort of season, and every season's a bit different, is this season started late and it feels like it's finishing early. So if you haven't got your honey off by now, you might make a decision whether you're going to leave honey for the bees. But if you're thinking about extracting, it's probably the right time to start thinking about getting the honey supers off soon, if not now. I've been going around over the last week taking them all off. I've got about 2 apiaries left to do. You need to know the Varroa load. If you came to the last sort of meeting, then we talked about Varroa. Varroa is one of the biggest killers of bees, and its impact over winter is not to be underestimated. There are several ways of treating for Varroa. The easiest one is to take your insert board, which doesn't stay under the hive all year round. It goes in for 1 week period.
Thanks.
Oh, hello. Was that you, Gary? I don't know if you want to mute yourself, mate.
Sorry.
No problem. If you put your inspection board underneath, some people put Vaseline on it, so whatever drops on it kind of sticks to it and they call it a sticky board. Sometimes people draw a grid line on it, because when you're looking for Varroa, once you've taken the board off, if you try and scan a whole board, your eyes go a bit squiffy. But if you scan these smaller sections, it's easier to kind of just kind of count Varroa. If you've not seen Varroa before, reddish, oval, about 1 mil by 1.5 mil, shiny if they're kind of the backs up. And I would strongly suggest that there's a really good brochure on Bee Base that this is a really old copy, but it's a downloadable. So if you go onto Bee Base and go on to advisory leaflet section, you can download and get hold of this. You will learn everything you need to know about Varroa from that booklet, and about the treatment times and about the different treatments. All the details you need to know are in there. But the key to the start of the process is monitor, find out if you need to do anything more. If you've got no mites or very, very low level, you don't need to do anything. But if you've got a high drop, you really need to start thinking about treating very soon. The reason why is most of the treatments become less effective with as the temperature drops. And a lot of them have a threshold of 15 degrees centigrade as an average daily temperature, an average high daily temperature. And we're already starting to get close up here to that. If you are treating, then most treatments used at this time of year need the honey supers to be removed. So otherwise you can taint the honey. The other thing you might be looking to do is start feeding. Again, make sure the honey supers are removed because you don't want to put sugar syrup into your honey supers. One tricky bit at this time of year is if you're starting to treat for Varroa and starting to feed at the same time, you may find, especially if you're using some of the thymol treatments, that the bees won't take the syrup down. I don't know what it is that means that they can't do the two things at once, but one seems to kind of, the syrup just doesn't seem to go anywhere when the thymol's on. So sometimes you have to make a bit of a balance. What's the bigger risk to this colony? Is it going to starve first, or is it going to starve, or is it going to succumb to Varroa? And often you may have to sort of bend slightly towards the kind of starvation is possibly the bigger risk. But that's going to depend on how bad the Varroa infestation is. But you might end up juggling a bit there. Some people move their bees up to the heather at this time of year. Once again, I think it's been an absolutely rubbish year up there from what a few people I've heard from, and some people seem to be coming back with less honey than they went up there with, and not doing so great. But I've never tried it myself. I'd love to sometime, but it's a bit of a lottery. Some years are great, and some years don't work so well. Check your colonies are queen right at this time of year. If you've got colonies that have been that you needed to split late, or you've been waiting for the queen to sort of emerge, and you've been waiting for the queen to start laying, it's getting late in the season. It's not impossible, but time's moving on. Again, if those colonies aren't queen right and they're struggling, you might want to make a decision about uniting. And also have a little think about robbing. I opened some colonies a couple of days ago, and left it open while I was doing looking at another colony. When I looked back shortly afterwards, I noticed that there were more bees than I was expecting, kind of on the first colony. And yeah, they were kind of robbing each. The open colony was being robbed. Wasps can be a problem as well. So narrowing entrances. And you might have to narrow them down, not only just put the entrance block in. Some people end up narrowing them down to just one bee space if the robbing's really bad. But it can be a significant issue, and you can keep. If someone's got their mic open, just pop yourself on mute. That'd be terrific. So watch out for robbing. Often it's hard to tell, but you might see the bees flying in this odd zigzag pattern as they approach a hive, because it's not their native hive and they're trying to stay out the way of kind of being detected. And often if you go into a super when there's robbing going on, you find all the cappings not neatly taken off the stores, but just ripped off the stores and looking really raggedy. So it can be a real problem late in this year. I don't think wasps that I've seen have been a huge issue this year, but that will vary place to place. Going back briefly to Varroa, if you've not seen them before, the red ovals that you can see around the dead bee here are Varroa. So that gives you some sort of relative scale. Could we mute yourself, please, if you got your mic open? Thank you, Brill. You see the relative scale. So you see the oval, you see the reddy brown. You can sometimes on some of them see the legs all towards the front of them. And again, that shininess if they've got their back up. Now, with that sort of drop in that sort of area around 1B, that's quite a heavy drop, and that would almost certainly need treating. Close up of the Varroa up there, just to kind of give you a kind of an idea of what it looks like. They are hard to spot. You might need a magnifying glass when there's all the hive debris, the wax and the chalk brood and bee legs and bits of whatever. If you need a magnifying glass to get in there and do a proper count, but when you're doing the count, you're counting the total number of bees, total number of mites you find on the board. You're dividing that by the number of days that the board was in the hive. So if it was 70 mites you found and the board was in for 7 days, you'd have an average drop of about 10 mites per day. And that would take you over the threshold for treatment at this time of year. Again, all the treatment thresholds you can find in a little graph. Let me just find it. You can find in a little graph in the Managing Varroa booklet. And that will tell you that at this time of year, if you've got a drop over about 8 mites a day, you really should be seriously thinking about treatment. And I'm not going to go into Varroa resistance and kind of hygienic hives at this point, because that's a whole different conversation for another day. Again, in the booklet I was just talking about, it will give you a list of all the products, and the ones you're going to be using at this time of year are probably the thymol-based products. So things like Apiguard, Thymovar, maybe Apilife Var, or those are often called the soft chemicals because they're based on natural, like thymol is thyme. You may choose to use some of the pyrethroids, which are sort of Varroa and Apistan, and some of the ones that are based on, and there's a relatively new thing called amitraz, which is used in sort of flea treatments for dogs and cats and things. Those are quite strong chemicals. They are effective. Always follow the labels as to the use of them. The label is the law, as the phrase goes. So it'll tell you the temperatures to use them in for maximum effectiveness. It will tell you that a lot of the time you can't use them when the super's on, how long to leave them on, and especially with the pyrethroids, the strong chemicals, don't leave them on all winter long. Otherwise you get the mites get resistant to them and the treatments don't work anymore. And often people will suggest using different treatments, different years, so you rotate them, you rotate your pest management. And all these things used together are called integrated pest management, which we went into the other week. I'm not going to go into it right now. You can always read up about that. But it's a series of treatments you use over the course of the year, just like keeping weeds down in the garden to manage your Varroa load. I tend to use Apiguard at this time of year. So we get into September. You really need to be finishing up your preparations then. So your Varroa treatments, often the Varroa treatments can take 6 or 8 weeks, so they may well be ongoing if you started them in August. You may well still be feeding. You may well still, your extraction is probably over, but some places get a late crop. You want to be doing your final checks for the year. You're probably spacing out your inspections because they're almost certainly not going to swarm at this time of year. So you can maybe put a couple of weeks between checks rather than checking every week. Maybe disturbing them a bit less at this time of year is a good thing, as long as there's no immediate problems that you need to deal with. If you had colonies on the heather, then they need to come back. They won't overwinter there. It's just migratory beekeeping. If you're looking to store your equipment, if you're storing empty supers but they've got frames in them, you may find wax moth a problem. Now, there's various things you can do about wax moth, but one thing you can do is isolate each box by just simply putting a couple of sheets of newspaper between each box, so the wax moth can't physically move easily from box to box. It's not a perfect thing, but it does often limit it. There are other treatments you can use to deal with wax moth, but just try and store them somewhere dry, indoors. You also want to clean your kit up over winter, but that's another topic altogether. You also might want to think about how you're going to set your hive up for winter, and I'll talk a little bit about the way I set my hives up for winter at the end. And it works for me, and I'll show you the way. I'm not kind of recommending it. I'm just sort of saying it works for me. I've done it for a long time and I've had low losses. If you want to give it a go, fine. If you've got another way that you think is better, no problem. But it's just, and like we said, with small colonies, is it time maybe if you want to get them through winter, just to think about whether they're polynuc with better insulation properties might be an idea. By the time we get to October, we really want to be leaving the colonies alone. Really kind of, unless there's a major reason to go into the colonies, you're going to be doing more harm than good. So if you're going to check the colonies, do it externally. On a warmer day, check what's flying in. Is pollen going in? Is there reasonable traffic going in and out of the hive? Hefting is this process of knowing roughly what a hive that you fed up ready for winter feels like weight-wise. And then over the winter, if that colony starts feeling light, you've got an idea of kind of the relative weight, and you might need to think about sort of adding extra fondant. Ventilation is a huge topic that beekeepers will argue about till the end of time. I will just mention that colonies, damp will kill colonies. So with open mesh floors, ventilation isn't normally a huge issue. People will talk about matchsticks and all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to go there because it just ends up as kind of people disagreeing with things. With open mesh floors, you should have enough ventilation. We've talked about strapping your colonies down for storms. Mouse guards, on from probably early October onwards. A mouse guard, if you haven't seen it before, there'll be some pictures a little bit later on. It's often a zinc piece of flat zinc with holes in it. The idea being that the skull of a mouse won't be able to pass through it. So mice looking for a nice warm nesting place over winter, who will make a real mess of your combs, can urinate and stuff in the hive and make it pretty unhygienic spot. If you get the mouse guards on early enough, the mice aren't ever going to establish in, and you can lose colonies or have colonies badly affected by not putting mouse guards on. So it's worth having to think about. Woodpeckers can be a pain over winter as well. It's green woodpeckers that do the damage. And what some people do is they put a chicken wire cage around their hives. It's around all four sides of the hive and the top. So the woodpeckers, if they cling onto the mesh, can't actually reach in to peck through the sides of the hive. I've not had an issue with it, but I know, again, it can be damaging, and it can ruin your kit, but B, it can damage the colony as well. Tidy up your apiaries, start thinking about cleaning kit and all those sorts of things. Putting in Varroa, I'd maybe put doing another check on your Varroa levels might be best to wait left until November rather than October. But if you want to do another quick check, there's no harm in it. As the temperature gets down to about 13 degrees, bees are going to start to cluster in the hive. And as we've talked about earlier, at 8 degrees or so on the outside of a cluster, bees can start to die. So those are sort of the temperatures where the winter cluster, and the winter cluster isn't a fixed thing. It will expand and contract and tighten and loosen as the weather changes. But 13 degrees is about the temperature it happens. And we've talked about damp and cold. So through the winter months, November, December and January, you're really doing precious little. Get your kit cleaned, which can be a long job if you've got a lot of kit. Get it all ready for next season. Realistically assess what extra kit, what did you run out of this season? Are you running with more colonies at the end of this season than you did last year? Because if you can buy it and build it in the winter months and get it in the sales, you're going to be getting it cheaper, and you're going to be building it when you've got spare time, which is not always the case if you try and pick up kit in sort of May, June, when it's at premium prices, hard to get hold of, and you haven't got time to build it when you get it. If you've got wax debris from the season, clean that up and use it for candles, or get it ready for wax exchange with the suppliers. Your monthly checks, and I go around to each of my apiaries about once a month. I'm not really going into the hives at all, apart from once for Varroa treatment in December, but I'm looking for any damage. I mean, it's just physical damage. Have the hives blown over in the storms, things like that. Good time for doing some reading or some study over winter. If you want to take any of the BBKA exams, you're not going to have time for it in the summer, but winter's a good time. In November, that's when I would be looking to put the Varroa monitoring boards in again, because I want, if I'm going to do an oxalic acid treatment, which is often the treatment of choice in midwinter, again, I want to know the Varroa level before I put the treatment on, because if there's no need to use chemicals, then don't use them. So again, board in for a week, take it out, count the mites, divide by the number of days, and in December, whereas in August, I was looking at sort of 8 mites a day as the threshold. In December, I'm looking at 2 mites a day as the average daily threshold. And above that, you need to think about treating. Also a good time in the middle of winter, we'll talk about how to use oxalic acid in a minute. Check your colonies from last year. Did you have some lovely colonies that were really productive and nice and gentle? Did you have some colonies that were horrible? You hated every time you went to them because they were grumpy, miserable bees, and you didn't get any honey out of them anyway. Just have a look at your colony records and see which are good, which are bad, which are indifferent, which colonies you might choose to breed from next year, which colonies you could really happily live without next year, and make a little bit of a plan for next season. Where would you like to be in 12 months' time? Would you like more? Would you like less? Would you like more of those and less of those? It doesn't need to be a tight plan, but just a little bit of an idea of where you're heading. Do you need a new site? Have you expanded a bit? And over winter is a good time to go and have a look at some sites if you need an out apiary. And don't forget to keep just hefting your bees and keeping an eye on whether they've got enough stores. Back to Varroa treatments again. And now the star indicates we're back onto the oxalic acid, which is the treatment of choice over winter. Comes in, the one I've always used is AP Bioxyl, which was the one that was available first in this country. The slightly weird thing about AP Bioxyl is it comes as a powder, and you have to make sugar syrup and you have to mix it in with the sugar syrup. So you're making your own kind of chemicals up. You need to wear PPE. It is a mild acid, so wear gloves, protect your eyes, things like that. But don't be hugely scared of it. But just take adequate protection. Some of the Oxavar and Oxy B come as pre-mixes. They'll also be more expensive, sadly. A little sachet of AP Bioxyl, 35 grams, will mix up and treat at least 10 hives. And again, in a minute, we'll go on to sort of talk about how to apply it. The reason it's such an effective treatment is you try and find a time of year, which people always used to say was between Christmas and New Year, but increasingly people are saying now is maybe earlier in December, when the colonies are broodless, because if you get the treatment on the bees when the colonies are broodless and all the mites are on the bees, not in the cells where the treatments don't reach, you have the maximum knockdown. And it can be 95% plus effective if you get the timing right. Now, you're not going to go through your colonies and check for brood at that time of year. So when you apply this treatment, you've got to take a little bit of a guess on when the broodless period is. It will be sometime in December if it happens at all. As I say, some people are suggesting it's nearer early December than around Christmas time now. The other treatments aren't relevant for this time of year. So applying oxalic acid, as I say, you get this little packet, which you need to mix into sugar syrup. The instructions on AP Bioxyl, now I said that the label is the law. On AP Bioxyl, when they got the product licensed, it was licensed for Italy. Some people will argue that the mix of a bit over 4% is a bit strong. The label instructions for the UK, and we'll mix it to about 3.2%, which is what always used to be used. I will later in the year, and there are on the files page of the Facebook page instructions for just amending that that mix a little bit. Again, wear gloves with it. Now, when you've mixed it and you take it out to the hives, ideally you take it out as a warm solution. It doesn't have to be hot, but you don't want to give them a cold shower in the middle of winter. Ideally, you choose a calm day, not too cold, not sort of -10, -15, but around 0. If you can find a decent day in winter where it's not lashing it down, doing all the things that winter does, just find the least worst day. The little pictures you can see of this little container are Thorns called these a trickle 2 container. And basically you can fill the container through the little red screw lid with solution. If you hold the little bottle in your hand with the, I don't know if you can see the tube down one side of it, if that's in the palm of your hand, as you squeeze it, it fills the little bubble reservoir with 5 ml of solution, and then only that 5 ml goes into each seam of bees. And 5 ml is the dose that goes into every seam. And by seam, I mean the gap between 2 frames. So if you can see that the outer couple of frames are completely empty, then there's no point in putting solution down it because it's just going straight through the floor. But if you can see bees in a seam, 5 ml, as I say, squeeze the bottle, fills the bulb, empty the bulb, move on to the next frame. And the trick is to do it as quickly as possible, to be crown board off through the box and out in a couple of minutes. You don't want to chill the hive because it's a rubbish time of year to be going into a colony, but it is an effective treatment. There is a little video on our YouTube channel of using the solution if the video would make more sense than the description I've just given. Okay, so now we're coming out of winter. Hopefully things have gone well so far. And often, sometimes you can get a false sense of security because you think, hey, great, my bees have made it this far. Terrific. There's only a couple of weeks to go. And then it can be really miserable when you go back in sort of later, a month later, and find that they died, because February and March is the toughest time to keep them through. We haven't talked much about putting fondant on. A lot of people will say the key time to put fondant on, and by fondant I mean the blocks of kind of ambrosia or baker's fondant that you can buy. They often come in 2.5 kilo kind of blocks. If you buy those blocks, you need to, don't do what I saw a few years ago, which is if you put them into a hive above a crown board with porta bee escapes on and don't cut open the plastic, the bees can't get to it. You need the bees, you need to either put the fondant on top of the frames, or if it's on top of the crown board, cut a big flap open in the plastic packaging it comes in, and make sure there are no porta bee escapes in the crown board, because the bees can't go through those. What some people will do is they'll put the fondant into sort of like takeaway containers and just pop them over the crown board holes. Starvation is the key issue in February and March, and especially if winter doesn't release and keeps going and going and going. And there is this concept of isolation starvation, which even if the bees aren't very far away from food, they can be a frame away from food, but it's so darn cold and they're clustered so darn tight that it's a bit like Scott at the Antarctic. Food's only over there, but they never quite got over there to get to it. So watch out for that. You can help it by having fondant on. Personally, I put fondant on from October onwards. And if the bees take it, fine, it costs me an extra couple of quid, but the colony makes it through. Some colonies will wolf it down, some colonies won't touch it. It varies. Other people will say, don't put the fondant on until February because you're mollycoddling colonies. I'd rather just get them through winter. So I put it on early. Don't start inspecting your colonies in February and March because you're not going to do anything helpful. Watch the outsides for activity. Watch out for, we have had winters where it suddenly warms up a bit, the colonies start to expand, and then the weather clamps down again for weeks and weeks. The colonies built up a bit, they were hungry, they were a bit short on stores, and then the weather clamped down and they've starved because of that. Just watch the fluctuations in the weather. This slide probably should be a little bit earlier, but this is just a little bit more about apigarxyl and oxalic acid. If you use any of these treatments, whether it's Apigard or whatever treatment you use, download please from the BeeBase, the National Bee Unit's website, the Veterinary Medicine Directorate report sheet, and fill it in, because that's your legal duty. And it's your legal duty then to keep hold of that for 5 years. Simple form, what did you put on? When did you put it on? What was the lot number and the expiry date of the product you use? Job done, file it. And this is a little bit about the different mix, but don't worry about it too much. Just ask me nearer the time. Okay, everything I've sort of said from here on previously is pretty standard advice and pretty standard stuff. You will find a helpful National Bee Unit leaflet called Preparing Colonies for Winter on BeeBase as well. That's a good one to download, although please, on the last page of it, or the penultimate page of it, where it goes, oh, it's fine to open colonies regularly through the winter, please disregard that bit. I don't know who wrote that, but they were having a very bad day at the office. If we're talking about brood diseases and your disease checks in the autumn, That leaflet again is well worth a look and a read. And that leaflet again is well worth a look and a read for diseases of adult bees and kind of a brood. So now I'm going to come on a little bit to what I do over winter. Take from it what you will, it works for me. So these are a couple of my colonies set up for winter. So the features you'll notice, if we look at colony number 20, it's got a mouse guard on. It's sitting on a stand raised up off the floor. It's got a big block underneath it. It's got a strap round it. It's got a block under the snow in the roof. So those are the starting points that we've already talked about. One of the things to watch out for if you use landing boards on your hives, that you can see the hive behind the tree there. The snow's piled up on the landing board and block the entrance completely. Now, with an open mesh floor, that's not a big issue because the air or flow will get through the bottom of the hive. But if the weather starts to improve and that snow's frozen like a block of ice, that can actually impede the bees getting out when they might get out. So, whereas I wouldn't clear the snow off the roof of the hive because it's a good insulator, I would clear the snow off a landing board. Now, what I do next is you'll see the bottom box above the floor is a super. Now, for me, that's a super ideally full of stores with sort of up to 20 pound of stores or whatever that I've left under the hive and probably put under the hive about this time of year or early September at the latest. The reason for doing it is that it raises the brood box up off the open mesh floor, so it gives them a little bit more shelter. It means the bees the queen is gonna lay in the brood box. When it comes to springtime and I want to and there's no queen excluder, by the way, between this super and this brood box, so the bees can travel up and down as they choose. In the spring, I don't have a super full of brood. I've got a brood box full of brood, so I can just take the box off at the bottom and plonk it on the top. It works for me. It's called nadering or under supering. Some people will say it's a load of rubbish. It works for me. Above that, I've got a crown board. Above the brood box, I've got a crown board, and you can see that the super I've got underneath, I've turned 90 degrees round because basically that super is empty, and what that super's got inside it is a block of fondant on top of the crown board and a block of cavity wall insulation just to give it a bit of top insulation. That's the configuration I've used for over 10 years now, and my losses are always pretty low. There are plenty of other ways of doing it. As I say, this is just the one that I do. So take from that what you will. Just to go through it a little bit more detail. So from the top down, there's a roof. Sometimes I put a second crown board above the super if I've got enough crown boards. Then there's the empty super with insulation and fondant. A crown board with no porta bee escapes in, so the bees can get up to the fondant. There's the brood box. There's a super with a load of stores in it. Obviously, if the brood box has got stores in it, leave those there. There is no queen excluder in this hive over winter. Then there's the open mesh floor, and there's a mouse guard on the floor. And that's my winter configuration. If I've got a colony that's in 2 brood boxes, to be honest, I might just leave it in 2 brood boxes rather than mess around with the super. But I will try and make sure that the stores in there are an adequate amount of stores. If this is any use, these are where some of the leaflets that I've talked about can be downloaded from. But basically, National Bee Unit is the first stop. And websites like the Apiarist, if you've ever read his blog, are really very good sort of places to go and look as well. And that's about it, folks. I don't think there's anything else, but now it's the time to come back. And if you're still awake, it's time if you've got any questions, please do shout out. I can't promise your colonies will get through winter, but you will average losses 10 to 15%. I tend to be below that most years. I just, it's a strongish colony, well fed and healthy with low mite count, has got a damn good chance of making it through winter. That's about it. Any questions? Silence.
Ian,
Yeah.
you said you put the entrance block upside down. So does that mean that the hollow bit is uppermost rather than down over? Is that what I'm taking it as?
My reason for doing that, and I've heard people sort of argue for it and against it, is that some colonies are quite hygienic and they will clear out all the dead bees, although it can be a little bit of a struggle getting dead bees out through a mouse guard. If you've got the entrance block in and it's upside down, so the cutout is facing up towards the super or the brew box or whatever's above it, the idea is, even if you've got a carpet of dead bees on your open mesh floor, hopefully the entrance is still open because it's raised up, even if it's only a centimetre or so. It is worth having a look as you go through winter each time you check in your apiary if the mouse guards are choked with dead bees. Because if a mouse guard does get choked with dead bees, just poke a stick through it, and please put your bee suit on before you do this, even if it's the middle of winter. But just check the mouse guards aren't blocked. And as I say, I turn the mouse guard at the entrance block upside down, and then pop the mouse guard over the top. Some people don't put the entrance block in at all. You'll get a range of opinions. Again, all I'll say is kind of that little technique as I heard a few years ago, and it seems to work for me. But I always do keep an eye on whether those mouse guards get blocked up, because they can, and then a colony can be in trouble because you don't notice, and it's shut in for weeks longer than it might otherwise be. Late on a Sunday night, I think everybody's ready for. I brought my beer with me. If you think of anything afterwards, you know where to find us. Just give us a shout. I hope that's gone through most things. Check the Varroa loads, get the feed on, unite colonies up so they're a decent size and healthy. Keep your fingers crossed that it's a halfway decent winter, and sort of we don't get a real mean winter. Colonies want to survive. They will if they possibly can. All we can do is just sort of stack the odds a bit in their favour.
Hi, Ian.
Hello, George.
It's George. Ian, just last year we done it. I managed successfully the first time to trickle the oxalic acid in between the seams, the frames.
Terrific.
And like you see, you need to open it briefly to do it.
Yeah,
we're doing really well with one of our colonies this year. We've got two brood boxes on. How would you go about doing it with the 2 brood boxes?
You're never going to know until the minute that you're doing it whether there's any brood in the bottom box or whether there's any bees in the bottom box or not. It depends how big the colony is. I have to say there have been some winters when I've done exactly what you're describing. I've gone through I've had a double brood colony and I've thought, nah, there won't be anything in the bottom box, but I've checked it and I've just quickly taken the top brood box off, put it on top of the lid, looked in it. If it's empty, obviously I don't do anything. Sometimes you find on big, strong colonies that you think, wow, I'd be happy with that midsummer, let alone at this time of year. Yeah, you need to treat each seam of bees. So if there's bees in that bottom box as well, 5 mil through every seam of bees in there. But obviously you've disrupted the colony a little bit more, but you needed to do the treatment. So just keep it quick, keep it simple, but yeah, do both boxes.
Yeah, okay. You'll probably have someone on hand to do it with you if you need
ideally, yeah, if you've got someone who can just slam the lid on kind of as soon as you kind of finished. and you pick a day where it's the least worst day, they won't like it, but it's in their best interests to do it, because it is a remarkably effective treatment at that time of year. So you might have broken the cluster, but it's not the end of the world. They break the cluster naturally when the weather warms up. They'll sort themselves out fairly quickly. Again, try and do it in the middle of the day so they've got the best chance before it gets dark and cold.
Okay, champion. Thanks, Ian.
Hey, no worries. If everybody's happy. But as I say, you know how to get in touch if you've got any questions. There's some resources to go and have a look at. I hope your bees all make it. I hope you've had a halfway decent season. It's been a bit of an odd one, but I hope it's gone well for you. And we'll be back again in, I can't remember the date, I think it might be the 13th of September. Just let me have a quick look. 14th of September, where at the Tuesday 14th, we'll be at the Cat and Dog Shelter with Sue Robinson from Hexham, talking all about wax processing and sort of and keeping sort of simple wax processing for hobby beekeepers, not kind of big scale stuff, and what you can do with the wax. And she want to do that as a practical demonstration, so we're going to do that one face to face. So I hope you can all come along to that. If you don't know where the Cat and Dog Shelter is, we'll be putting some information out to find it, but we're going to go back to face-to-face meetings unless the world falls off its axis again. But hopefully it won't. Have a lovely evening, folks. Thank you ever so much for coming along. Give us a shout if you need anything, and I hope your bees make it through until the springtime. And I hope you managed to get some honey this time of year. Good night.
Cheers, Ian. Thanks very much.
You're
Bye now.
welcome, mate.
Thanks, Ian. Well done.
As you say, David, definitely beer time.
Take care. Bye.
Night. Good night, all.